Here is the inside story of these modern gasolines.
One of the great cognitive dissonances of our time is that of climate change, an all-consuming issue of singular urgency whose effects will ripple through centuries, generate millions of refugees, and send useful land back to the sea. It's also something that doesn't actually get that much quality media attention compared to other less urgent issues, and the angle of discussion often skirts the most consequential information. So here is John Kerry talking with Joe Scarborough about climate change and China.
Can you explain why there can be no improvement in the global climate without China being a part of it, because they're such a big player in global emissions?
That's a simple equation, Joe. I mean, I'm not saying I think you have to tell the truth. If China makes a move and does something positive and constructive, it's important to recognize that. It doesn't mean you're turning away from a host of other issues that you've just listed, all of which are real. China, that produces 28% of all the world's emissions, we're at 11%. China's at 28%. We can't get where we need to go to be net zero by 2050 if China isn't joining in that effort.
Joe Scarborough, who is just such a reliable dunce, whenever there's a discussion about climate change on his show, it's always wrapped in that existential urgency, but really it's sapped of materiality. Because for some, climate change is just something to signify the extent to which one is a modern liberal. Solutions discussed in the media are meant to reassure us that nothing has to be different. There will be no cost to climate change mitigation. There will be no personal sacrifice, just solar arrays and wind turbines and jobs. And then blame is always directed outward. Climate deniers are presented for us to be appropriately outraged by, and then that outrage confirms our commitment to climate change. Even if we personally have no intention of changing our lifestyles or being critical of politicians we're not already critical of, if you applaud Morning Joe's hand-wringing, basically you've done enough. You're an activist. It really comes down, actually, to whether or not China gets serious. So allocating blame to China or Republicans, at least as a dominant media narrative, is not always helpful, and it's not even always fair. First, in this discussion about China, one factor is totally ignored, which is the outsourcing of manufacturing. If the US imports goods from China, the emissions from manufacturing those goods go towards China's CO2 balance, not the US. If the emissions from China's exports were tallied in the destination country's balances, China's balance would be 10% lower. If you count the emissions from imported products, the US emissions go up 6%, Germany's emissions go up 14%, Switzerland's emissions go up more than 200%. And then the transportation between countries, which accounts for a couple percent of global emissions, don't get tallied in either country. But okay, that's only one factor. That's not to say that China and India and other major emitters don't have serious work to do. That's all worth discussing, of course, but this common narrative that it's essentially all in China's hands is a way out of dealing with our own culpability, because clearly Joe was being hyperbolic, but improvements could occur even without serious Chinese efforts. But people like Scarborough have this narrative almost entirely displace other discussions that national audiences would benefit from being exposed to. So Mike Barnacle has an important question here.
You just mentioned 80%. So 80% of the fossil fuels in the world produce 80% of the energy, fossil fuels, of the emissions.
Yeah.
So everybody's talking about like wind power, solar power, electric power, Teslas and everything like that. How do we catch up? What's the timetable to catch up? 80% is a daunting number to knock down.
Well, 80%, actually the fact that it's concentrated in 20 countries gives you an opportunity to really work together to concentrate the effort to do something.
There was an author interviewed a day later on Morning Joe who had some book about something to do with having conversations with climate deniers. She said something about how Texas, where she's from, now gets 23% of its electricity from clean energy. But what percentage of total energy is that? Because electricity and total energy are different. Most of our energy does not come from electricity, and most of our electricity is not clean. So that was an important realization that Mike Barnacle had, met unfortunately with a platitude, which was that 80% of our energy still comes from fossil fuels. And clearly we're not going to be able to switch that all over to renewables in the next few years, also because fossil fuel has an energy density that is unmatched by clean technologies. So the answer can't just be to switch the grid over to solar panels, because even if electricity is totally clean, the grid is only one piece. We have not just an addiction, but a dependence on fossil fuel. So truly, do we have time to be thinking about getting everyone electric cars and charging stations? Or do we have to do something else in the meantime? But that author and Kerry's response are emblematic of the other popular media narrative around climate change, which is a Pollyannish view that technologies and financing will extricate us before it's too late.
I've worked with the 6 largest banks in our country, and they have made a decision on their own that they're going to commit $4.16 trillion to this transition over the course of the next 10 years. Massive amounts of money are trying to get battery storage that will last longer than 4 hours and 6 hours. If you get battery storage that could last a week, we've won the battle. It's over. Because then you can make up for the times when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. Because of President Biden's diplomacy, we now have 55% of global GDP committed to keep the 1.5 degree limit alive.
Well, we don't have those batteries yet, and people should understand that the 1.5 degrees is not a guarantee.
Have we lost the hope? No and yes. According to this report, we are still having a chance to stop the negative climate trend during the mid of this century by especially limiting the use of fossil fuels and by stopping deforestation. At UN, our aim is to reach 1.5 degree warming level, which would be best for the welfare of mankind and biosphere. Now we are heading towards 2 to 3 degrees warming instead.
So he was from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he says we're not really on target to meet the 1.5 degrees. We're headed towards 2 or 3, and that we have to cut out fossil fuels and deforestation. The answer could be that we have to cut fossil fuel use faster than clean energy can actually replace it. That is a possible solution. And agriculture is the main cause of deforestation, so maybe a discussion about reducing our meat consumption would be more valuable than ones about future technologies. But on Scarborough, and lots of other media, we have none of that. Instead, we have officialdom come and tell us who's primarily culpable, China, and that the banks are on it.